Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this Visualizing Vulnerabilities Differently webinar, proudly hosted by Team CRS. Let us get started by giving you an overview of CRS and then move on to an intro to your hosts for the day. CRS is a cybersecurity distributor, an authorized IBM training center, a Red Hat and SUSE training partner. We also offer AGILE training. Our head office is based in Centurion, South Africa. We have training centers in Centurion, Midrand, Sandton, and Cape Town. We operate pretty much throughout the globe with a major focus on South Africa, SADC, English-speaking Africa, North America. This includes all three of the countries, the USA, Canada, and Mexico. Although we have completed training globally, including across Europe, as well as the Middle East. Moving on to our hosts for the day. Myself, I am Dylan Null, Head of Vendor Engagement. I have a vast knowledge of the cybersecurity industry in South Africa and across Africa. Moving on to Jacobijn van Ntini, Technical Account Specialist, a versatile and emerging talent in the cybersecurity space. Jacobijn van Ntini hails from Johannesburg, South Africa, and has a proven track record of excellence, willpower, and advancement. He is equipped with the ability to be a critical thinker, a person who analyzes seemingly complex concepts and makes them easier to consume. We then also have Tristan Govender, who is a senior sales engineer, product lead for TOPIA, and IBM and Red Hat sales specialist. Mr. Govender has a vast knowledge on threat hunting, vulnerability management, patch management, and has assisted global companies with their cybersec professional services. This includes the world's largest or one of the world's largest breweries. He has a passion that drives every interaction. Moving on to the agenda, we have a very important, albeit in-depth overview of vulnerabilities and how to deal with them. The team will be covering the current vulnerability management workflow, issues faced in today's markets relating to vulnerabilities, concepts of patching, where and how to, or where TOPIA should fit in. How does TOPIA change vulnerability management workflows? We also will be ending off with a Q&A. So guys, please load your questions and let's see if we can paint these gentlemen into a corner. With that being said, let me hand over to Mr. Van Ntini, who will be talking, or at least taking us into an overview of current vulnerability workflows and the current issues in the vulnerability management space.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Dylan. So let us take a look at vulnerability management for a moment. So generally, we're looking into several different factors that will determine a full remediation cycle. Swiftly, let us take a look at the general workflow as is presented on the screen. You can see how many days or weeks that might take. So the general outline of such a workflow goes as follows. Firstly, you'd have to prepare for that scan. So that would entail you having to determine the scope of the scan in order to identify the targeted systems, networks, or IP ranges that would need to be scanned. Thereafter, you would obviously have to configure the network scanner. So that means you would need to set up the scanning tool with the appropriate settings, such as the scan type, for example, full scan or targeted scan. So scanning options and scan frequency is something that you'd also have to consider. Secondly, you'd have to conduct the actual scan. At this point, you'd initiate the network scan, which would entail of running the network scanner tool in order to identify the vulnerabilities and security weaknesses in the designated targeted areas. Thereafter, logically speaking, you'd obviously have to do a scan duration. So this is something that you would have to consider. This would allow the scanning process to complete, which may vary depending on the size and complexity of the network that is being scanned. Thirdly, you'd analyze the results. So once you've analyzed the results, the analysis outputs generated by the network scanner, which typically includes a list of vulnerabilities that are discovered, their level of severity, affected systems, and their potential impacts. Another thing to consider in this, for this particular point, is the prioritization of vulnerabilities. So you'd be classifying the vulnerabilities based on their severity. For the case of TOPIA, you would have your critical high, medium, low, right? In order to focus on the most significant threats that require the most immediate attention. There's also the validation of the findings from that prioritization that you did. This is where you'd cross-reference the identified vulnerabilities, have a known security vulnerability, and ensure the accuracy of your scan results. Fourth, you have your risk analysis. So at this point, you're conducting a risk assessment in order to evaluate the impact of the identified vulnerabilities on the network infrastructure, your systems, and your data. Further, you also have to determine the level of exploitability. So once you do that, you assess the likelihood of the vulnerabilities which could possibly be exploited successfully by a threat actor, for example. Once you've done that, you have to consider the context. So taking into account the additional factors such as your criticality, potential compliance issues, as well as your impact when prioritizing your vulnerabilities. That all encompasses that contextualization, right? So then fifth, you'd have your remediation, your mitigation. This includes developing a plan, a remediation plan rather. So once you've created that remediation plan, you're addressing the identified vulnerabilities, which could include your prioritization of fixes, which are based on the risk assessment, obviously. Coordination with the stakeholders is something that you would have to do based on what you found throughout that remediation plan. So communicating with your stakeholders, the remediation plan, which is relevant to specific teams, such as your system administrators, your network engineers, or perhaps even your software developers. Once the stakeholders have hold of that, they would have on their hands the task of implementing their fixes. So once you're implementing the fixes, this includes your application patching, updates, your configurations in order to remediate those vulnerabilities. This may include the security patches, for example, updating software versions, reconfiguring network devices, or even strengthening your access controls. Once that process is done, you'd have to retest and verify in order to apply the fixes, conduct additional scans if needs be, or test to ensure that the vulnerabilities have been successfully addressed and that there are no new vulnerabilities that have been introduced into your environment. Sixth, you would have a reporting and documentation stage. So documenting the process allows you to maintain your records of the scan results, your risk assessments, remediation activities, and other such relevant information. Once that process is done, you generate your report. So by preparing a comprehensive report which would summarize the scan results, vulnerabilities, risk assessment findings, and your remediation tasks taken, you would have that documentation on board just to have a visual concept of everything that's happening in that regard. Once that physical component is complete, you would have to obviously share out that report and your findings in order to distribute the reports to your stakeholders, such as your management, your IT teams, auditors, just to ensure that that full level of transparency is in place so that you can facilitate efficient decision-making processes. Then finally, you would have to review and have a continuous improvement process in place in order to evaluate the effectiveness of that whole remediation process. So assessing the overall effectiveness of the vulnerability workflow and the network scanner in identifying your mitigation of the vulnerabilities, it allows you to have that think about exactly what's going on in your environment. Once that is done, you would incorporate feedback into your process. So by gathering your input from relevant stakeholders in order to identify areas for improvements, for example, and make necessary adjustments to your workflow or your scanning process. Once that is complete, you would update your vulnerability management practices just to stay up to date with your emerging threats, new vulnerabilities, and industry best practices, just to enhance, make more efficient that vulnerability management program. So I've laid all these out. These timelines that you see are based on a dedicated vulnerability team or cybersecurity specialist team, or individual for that matter, that is dealing with the vulnerabilities within your organization. So say, for example, your organization has on average 1,000 devices. So they're a mixed bag of endpoints, servers, and network devices. This essentially means that there's a 3 to 4 week scanning cycle that is in place, typically, but that 3 to 4 weeks actually tends to be 5 weeks if we're being completely honest with ourselves. Tend to take 5 weeks of a remediation efforts from the standpoint of a new scan. So this is exactly what brings issues into the vulnerability remediation processes of today. So now we are faced with a number of challenges in the cybersecurity space. We're faced with a number of challenges as it pertains to your cybersecurity environment, cybersecurity space in general. So in the first quarter of 2022, there were 8,051 vulnerabilities that were published, which is quite significant, if I do say so myself. So the typical working week cycle is in a month is 4 weeks, and the average remediation time is around 58 days, right? So you can see the impasse that has been created there, right? So further, there's 1 in 4 companies that are still susceptible to vulnerabilities that are older than 2 years. Third-party applications tends to be the entry point for targeted attacks. Then also something to consider is patching tends to be considered an IT task, not something that working in general tend to take attention to. So all of these issues that I've laid out that you can see all point to one major issue. The current vulnerability workflows, they just don't work. Right, so given that I've pointed that they just don't work, what can we consider, right? So we have your most scanning mechanisms that just aren't keeping up with the current world of threats. They don't give you that real world view of vulnerabilities, because whether it's authenticated or unauthenticated scan, if there are misconfigurations, or if there's bad inventory to work with. The picture of clear risk and an extensive understanding of vulnerabilities in your environment tends to fall away in that regard. There's also, the next thing is the remediation cycles, meaning that an already stretched cybersecurity team, as we know in South Africa, there's a lack of, right? So that means that the cybersecurity teams tend to be overstretched. They're on tight timelines, tight schedules, where vulnerabilities get left for the next cycle, for example, due to interrupted workflows. So given that, if new reports with new vulnerabilities are being published every 3 to 4 weeks, right, which remediation cycle is 3 to 4 weeks, it can actually end up taking your cybersecurity team around 5 weeks, because they're just so overburdened with everything that they have to take on board. So what that means is that your IT team, your cybersecurity team, whomever is in charge of that remediation, tends to be behind schedule as it pertains to remediation schedules or opening up the organization, which would obviously open up your organization to extended or high levels of risk. There's also false positives to consider. So in terms of false positives, when there's a lack of discovery and context or even configurations, there most likely will be a false positive which would lead to a vulnerability. And your cybersecurity team would obviously, logically speaking, spend more time on qualifying the vulnerability as opposed to going about to remediate said vulnerabilities. That brings us to patching. So what is the concept of patching? Concept of patching revolves around the process of fixing vulnerabilities or bugs in software, for that case, operating systems, or even firmware, which patching involves the application of updates known as patches, right, to address security flaws, improve performance, or even to add new features. Taking a look at these statistics once again, you would have 29% of businesses have experienced data loss due to an unpatched vulnerability, which is avoidable. You have had 95% of cyber attacks which target unpatched vulnerabilities. Excuse me. On average, it takes an organization around 106 days to patch a vulnerability, which is a third of the year. So just goes to show how extensive that problem tends to be. 82% of your successful cyber attacks use known vulnerabilities for which a patch is available. And then finally, you would have 29% of businesses which experience data loss due to an unpatched vulnerability. All right, so these statistics are mainly caused by the fact that patching is generally seen as an IT-related function, right? As I mentioned before, just to ensure that functionality and these features are in place. That's why the tasks tend to be delegated to your IT team. So this also becomes IT team to identify the correct patches just because of the tools that they are using, right? So I've laid out all the stats with the tools that are currently available. It makes patching a bit difficult. Why? Because many tools require external resources such as knowledge bases, advisory links in order to find those patches. All that means that your systems are not always getting the patches that they require, but rather they're getting what is found and what is seen to be necessary. This is where TOPIA would come into assist. And on that note, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Tristan Govender.
Thanks for that, Jacobin. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining today. Exactly what you're saying. I just want to start off with the point is TOPIA was developed by a company called Vicarious, right? Vicarious has developed TOPIA as a vulnerability and patch management tool and has done an excellent job at redefining the way that we have vulnerability management processes. The process is more of a continuous flow with TOPIA, being able to detect and display vulnerabilities in near real time. And this means that remediation cycles are now thrown out of the window. So we see that security teams can now prioritize and more appropriately respond to vulnerabilities with TOPIA. With this, it also enables a more collaborative approach to patch management between security and IT teams. I know that we all have seen, when it comes to organizations who have those teams siloed, that tends to be a ongoing conversation of what patches need to be done and who decides on them and etc. TOPIA allows for that collaborative approach. And let's take a look at exactly how TOPIA does this, right? So, welcome to the TOPIA dashboard. The dashboard is populated with real-time data from on-prem, work-from-home, and cloud-based assets. TOPIA is an agent-based solution. From your home dashboard, we see that the applications are sorted according to risk within TOPIA. This is calculated by using contextual exploitation properties, which we'll dive into deeper shortly. With TOPIA, you're able to reduce risk in a very, very short amount of time, even 2 minutes. And this is with patch and patchless management. Let's take a look at how. As you can see, exploring the high-risk applications, Office has a patch available and the vendor severity for the patch is high. So let's go ahead and update it. From here, you're able to select your date range, starting time, duration, time zone, and reboot settings. Select your asset, and it's as simple as that. Okay. We can see that there's still a whole lot of high-risk applications within our assets here. So let's use some automation to take care of the Office application. One thing that we'd be able to do is update by using auto actions. So by creating an auto action, we'd be able to schedule the updates to happen for Office update by vendor severity of critical and high. So let's select Office, selecting critical and high, selecting for all our assets, and setting the frequency for every week on a Monday in a specific date range, in a specific action window to run over a certain period of hours, selecting our time zone, and it's as simple as activating this. Now we don't have to worry about having to do the patching for Office for your critical and high level vulnerabilities. This is an automatic reduction of CVEs within your environment. Within the applications, you can see that there are even more high-risk applications with no patches available. So let's jump back there. As an example, we have WebEx meetings. So something that we'll be able to put into place is patches protection, and we'll definitely delve into how that works shortly. But essentially, we'll be able to put this into a monitored or protected mode. With TOPIA, the highlight of the solution is to get on top of vulnerabilities in your environment by presenting new workflows. And this is empowered by TOPIA's ability to continuously detect vulnerabilities in your environment and even the mitigation for them. It also gives you a refreshing stance on patch management workflows being directly related to reduction of vulnerabilities, bringing your IT and security teams closer in operations than ever before. This enablement of collaboration allows you to get rid of your backlog of vulnerabilities and stay ahead of vulnerabilities before exploits are found. Another view that you would be able to have when it comes to TOPIA is a asset risk view for each and every specific asset. So you would be able to address vulnerabilities across your entire asset all at once by taking a look at exactly what updates are required for the specific endpoint. So we can just click Update, select all of our applications, create as an auto action so that we can continuously run these actions, or update once, select your endpoint, select your settings, and simply update. Simply as easy as that. Something that we mentioned is that TOPIA leverages off of contextual-based prioritization. This is in the form of something called X tags. When it comes to X tags, you no longer have to only do your prioritization based on your critical, high, medium, and low, or essentially off your CVSS scores. You now have the ability to have your prioritization down to a level of organizational use. As an example, if you only want to deal with critical vulnerabilities that have an attack surface in your environment and yield a confidentiality impact, you simply just select the X tags that you would want and filters your whole dashboard for you. This goes for your CVS threat, CVE threat as well. So we'd be able to look at the specific applications that yield these risks and remediate based on those actions. How does patches protection work? It is a multi-layered security mechanism which, upon the configured policy, secures the executable of the vulnerable software and its related binaries. So we see it picks up on binary level vulnerabilities and secures them. This is achieved by securing the memory space of the vulnerable software from any injection or scraping related attempts, and also by securing the vulnerable functions in memory. The in-memory protection uses state-of-the-art dynamic binary instrumentation technology that tracks the vulnerable functions upon loading to the memory space of the vulnerable assets, and then upon the exploitation, the implemented code either notifies the system admin or blocks the system call in memory. Okay, depending on which one you choose, whether you're just choosing to notify or whether you are choosing to protect. Okay, so with that short demo, let's take a look at a few of the key features of visibility that TOPIA will provide for you. First of all, we have real-time asset inventory. This will show you which assets are actively checking into TOPIA, but then we also have your zero-day detection. And how does this work? TOPIA collects and analyzes software binaries for patterns to determine vulnerable spots in the libraries. It's like DNA mapping, which identifies weak genes within your system. It uses a predictive method for your vulnerabilities based on the environments which it's analyzing. Like we mentioned, it does a lot of contextual based vulnerabilities to also reduce the amounts of false positives within your environment. Okay, TOPIA's detection engine is composed of 3 parts. First of all, you're going to detect your targets, which will examine the behavior of malware samples to see which parts of the software they are abusing. It finds similarities, so a machine learning algorithm finds similarities between them to identify a common targeted characterization. It will then create patterns. So the common target characterization patterns are used for similar targets in every application within the organization. So, excuse me. So with that, you also have a continuous vulnerability detection and network scan. So that zero-day detection or prediction is definitely going to help you to motivate a lot of the remediation actions with TOPIA, but most definitely it will also help you to have that proactive approach to security to fortify your entire network. Okay, you also have a continuous vulnerability detection and network scanning. So this has been mentioned a few times where we spoke about TOPIA being able to continuously detect on vulnerabilities. And what essentially that means is that you don't have to be running scans every 30 days. You can just actively work on what is seen in your environment. But when it comes to all of those devices that you cannot deploy an agent onto, what do you do? Okay, this is exactly where we have automated network scans. So through the auto actions, you would be able to automate scans that will collect information and report them to your dashboard so that you have more of a real-time view of your network vulnerabilities as well. So it makes it very, very easy to take a look at things like vulnerabilities within your routers, your switches. This also means that you have a deeper insight into network-based vulnerabilities with visibility of devices, services running, ports that are open, OS families that are found, and of course the CVEs within that network of devices. There's also third-party application coverage, and this is where lots of competing tools seem to lose a lot of visibility into application-based vulnerabilities. And when they do tend to report on these vulnerabilities, we have seen a 20 to 40% rate of false positives within those tools. I'm sure that everyone who has worked with network-based scanning tools can attest to those features where we take a look at a lot of false positive reports and a lot of business risk reports that need to be submitted for these cases. This is also where TOPIA, which has deeper levels of analytics and visibility, is able to give you more accurate and present more accurately on vulnerabilities. So in terms of discovery, we see that TOPIA actually has better visibility, and to be more accurate, it has 10 times more visibility into vulnerabilities within your devices and your network than that of a competitor. This means that majority of organizations are facing risk levels that they are not even aware of. And with the statistics shared by Jacobijn, we foresee a major issue in the future that's arising. I'm going to pop through a link in the chat, which will essentially give you the coverage that TOPIA is able to showcase through its application and OS patch catalog. And with that coverage, you also have your coverage of vulnerabilities, right? So not only will it be detecting on what it can patch, but it does a whole lot more. So you have a more real-time picture of what your organizational risk is like. Something mentioned in the short demo was also contextual exploitation properties of applications and assets. And what does this mean? It means that threat analysis and prioritization isn't a one-size-fits-all deal. We've all dealt with CVSS scores and your CV ratings and etc., but they don't consider your organization's unique infrastructure, right? They don't consider your customers' unique infrastructure. Contextual factors play a much larger role in the overall threats of a vulnerability than other risk management solutions take into account. That's exactly why TOPIA's X tags give you a real-time, contextually based report that highlights the real threats so that your IT and InfoSec teams can confidently prioritize risk remediation. This means that you take that 1,000 number of vulnerabilities and you would be able to reduce it down to a prioritized level that is accurately that is more approachable and more accurate to the risk of your organization. For example, if you had to look at just as what has an attack surface, right, that's showing you just what is exploitable within your organization. Right. Each tag defines a contextual execution property of an application on the asset, and X tags help you prioritize threats using context-based properties like prioritization parameters, access authority, and activity status in order to determine the risk level of every application and asset in your organization. Right. So how does this work in a bit of deeper level? First of all, you have a software structure analysis because TOPIA understands the software components specific to the environment. It has the capability. To derive risk assessments for each CVE. So it dissects the software components and associates libraries, executables, and resources with each and every application. Then it collects contextual-based data. So it has an internal and external data feeds which gather to contextualize the assets according to who's using it, on what assets, and how. And then it constructs a risk profile. So for example, you have a risk score which is calculated based on the unique exploitation of the properties that TOPIA has found. Okay. So in terms of remediation, some may still be wondering, what is the reason you would want to have a continuous vulnerability or remediation cycle? The reason for this is simple. Vulnerabilities discovered and CVE databases discovery never stops. We saw that statistic where there was over 8,000 vulnerabilities found in a single quarter, which means that there are always going to be vulnerabilities within your environment. With TOPIA, you're able to see in near real time whether a vulnerability has been remediated by an action that you've taken, and you don't have to wait for 30 days for this. This also means that as a new vulnerability is discovered, you are able to work more proactively to fortify your environment before an exploit is found. Something that we also would be looking at is the ability to find advisory links, so that you would be able to address vulnerabilities that do not have patches. So TOPIA makes this quite simple with vSociety, and vSociety is a purpose built for a security community, which means that you are able to turn security conversations into remediation access. So if you are not able to find a remediation action, other security experts may be able to assist. And vSociety is an open, independent, and user-centered community with features built specifically to make vulnerability research shareable and actionable at scale. So something else that we look at is streamlining your organization's vulnerability management workflow and decreasing operation costs with auto actions. TOPIA's auto action capability enables your IT and cybersecurity teams to automate repetitive, tedious, and time-consuming tasks like patch implementation so that they can refocus their expertise where it's needed the most. First of all, hardening your cybersecurity posture by decreasing the chance of human error, and setting up automated responses to specific triggers. You can use auto actions in whatever way works best for your organization. However, just a couple of things that it'd be able to do is common task automation, application deployments, optimization mitigation, and scheduled reporting. So with that in mind, you also have the ability to automate your patches if necessary, generally seen more on the endpoint side of things. But auto actions is a powerful tool that you would be able to use in that case. This is the business highlights for TOPIA. We see that it has quite a few reference sites. The biggest for Africa or South Africa is definitely ABM Bev, and we have seen it in quite big names across the globe as well. So I'm also going to paste through a link in the chat box to sign up for a POC, and we'll definitely be able to assist you with that. And I think we most definitely still have time for questions.
Excellent. Tristan Govender, thank you very much for that. Very insightful. There are a couple of questions, but first one would be, with patch management, are patches tested by TOPIA prior to receiving them?
It's still necessary to test patches, obviously, on your QA devices, just to ensure that all your functionality that is required is still available. Hope that answers your question.
It absolutely does, yes. And TOPIA retrieves patches straight off of the vendor repository. So thanks for that, Jacobane. But still, like you said, it is necessary to test the patches as you were mentioning. Next question would be, how does TOPIA from Vicarious ensure that data privacy and security? Yeah.
Thanks for that. So TOPIA maintains your SOC 2, your Type 2 compliance, just so that you can check your trust highlights. There's a link that I'll post in the chat box with those trust highlights.
Okay, excellent. All right, thank you there for that, Jacobane. I hope that answers the question fully. Moving on, can you provide examples or case studies that demonstrate the impact of using TOPIA's vulnerability management tool in terms of improved patch management efficiency and reduced security risks? Let me know if I should repeat that one. That's quite a mouthful.
Yeah, most definitely. So as you mentioned, I work with an organization that maintains servers with no patching history. This was due to a mismanagement of SSEM mainly, but this meant that a lot of servers within the environment were susceptible to attack. So using the information from TOPIA on the KBs, especially what the descriptions were laid out within the actual platform of TOPIA, I provided them a list of KBs relating to security patches that needed to be done and the number of CVEs that each patch would address, which allowed them more visibility into the necessity and urgency for the patches. And with SSCM, it took the team about 2 weeks to deploy patches to a test environment, and we only ended up deploying the patches in the following month. With TOPIA, we're able to deploy the patches to a test environment within an evening, concluded testing within a week, and made it in time for Patch Tuesday in the following week. So not only does TOPIA give a deeper insight into patches, but that needed to be deployed, but also makes the deployment procedures a lot faster.
I hope that answers the question. Moving on to the next one. What will be the objective to run the scan on the unsupported OS device, example EOL, because of virtue of the asset being unsupported, it means the assets is vulnerable to any evolving threats?
Yeah, most definitely. Okay, so end of life. I mean, that's a very good question, and we are seeing that most organizations are slowly phasing out the end of life devices. It is most definitely something that needs to speed up in process because, exactly as you mentioned, by virtue end of life is susceptible to high levels of risk, regardless of how much of patching you're going to do on that and how many CVs are found. Right, so we've seen that with a lot of older OSs like 2008, 2012, right? But TOPIA is still able to assist, and exactly what I mentioned, the organization that I assisted with from a TOPIA aspect, they still had those end-of-life devices because most organizations still run applications that require them. So what do they end up doing? if they still need that protection when they are still busy with the migration processes, they would make use of the patchless protection. So it's still good to have that visibility of your CVs and vulnerabilities and do the scans on end-of-life devices, because for a lot of places it's required for compliance, but it doesn't mean that it cannot be addressed in some aspects. I mean, you're still going to need things like your EDR systems and etc. to help you protect, but from a vulnerability management, patch management perspective, your end of life still needs to be covered in that way as well.
Okay, excellent. All right. Reducing vulnerability concerns and streamlining patch management is key for firms today as they deal with the internal and outside world. I like that it helps with real-time views that proactive actions can be taken, leaning towards better observability in the space. Not so much a question, but thanks for that insight, Pooven. Much appreciated. Goes a long way. Are there any specific industries or use cases where TOPIA Vicarious excels?
No, I think it's necessary pretty much everywhere. TOPIA can be used anywhere and everywhere. As you can see with the reference sites on the screen, it pretty much fits into all verticals. They have a wide array of customers who are making use of the solution in various different industries. Definitely one that's growing in interest in South Africa and Africa. So yeah.
Okay. Excellent. What kind of support or customer service is available for TOPIA Vicarious users?
Within Africa, CRS ensures that all TOPIA resellers are upskilled to the point of being first-line support for the solution, with CRS being second-line support. And if you're a reseller or MSP and CRS cannot assist, Vicarious HQ does reside in Israel and the US, allowing you to have support around the clock.
Oh, nice. Okay. How long is the recommended waiting period before conducting a retest?
So with TOPIA, like I mentioned, it's more of an ongoing vulnerability detection. So you wouldn't really have that retest. And biggest reason for that is because we see organizations are very hesitant to run retests consistently. So what they end up doing more especially is that they would go and do a scan every 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. And every time there's a vulnerability remediation action that takes place, then they would wait for that new report to come out before they understand whether it's been mitigated or not. In comparison to TOPIA, where on the dashboard in near real time, it'll show you whether your vulnerability has been mitigated or not. Right. It also shows you real-time flow of new vulnerabilities within your environment so that you're able to control those. Okay, so in terms of retest, we have seen organizations do it 1 to 2 weeks, every 1 to 2 weeks for, let's say, your overall or your retest on specific assets using other tools, but with TOPIA, that's not necessary.
Okay, excellent. After generating the report or documentation, is it customary to deliver a presentation to the client, IT team, or management?
I think that's very much dependent on the organization. Those types of conversations are definitely laid out by your high level management and etc. on what their expectations are. Or let's say you are MSP, a reseller, you may have an agreement for your customers, as an example. We have seen in some instances there are organizations who do that, but again, it's going to come down to the organization and how they work.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. All right, thanks for that, Tristan. Guys, a reminder to raise your hand should you have questions. We will then unmute you and you can feel free to verbalize your question. But moving on to the next question, which vulnerability frameworks are most effective for testing? For instance, NIST, OWASP, the Web App Security Consortium, those sorts of things.
Again, it depends on purpose, depends on what the organization is trying to achieve. Generally, a lot of the clients, organizations, or your MSP, resellers, etc., they would choose which framework they want to abide by for a specific purpose. If you are a vendor organization, as an example, then you may work through a specific framework, and if you are end user organization, you would want to work through another framework. So again, it's very much dependent on the customer, on the organization that you are in.
Okay, excellent. Are there any incentives for clients to patch critical vulnerabilities such as government regulations and compliance requirements?
Incentives, I mean, the biggest incentive is not getting attacked, right? It's minimizing your points of risk. I think that's definitely one that will, the biggest parts about your critical and high level vulnerabilities is that the vendor is saying that these will be addressing specific vulnerabilities within their application or within the specific system. So there is definitely a level of compliance to it for a lot of organizations. We do see this with banks and financial institutions quite a lot as well. But specifically in this case, we'd see doing those patches would reduce your overall risk to attack. So that's going to be your major incentive, yeah. Or
Okay.
should be your major incentive, yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. Do you expect any cybersecurity trends to emerge from the widespread adoption of AI tools, such as an increase in sophisticated or devastating cyber attacks? And then conversely, do you foresee the development of more AI-driven vulnerability scanning tools as a positive outcome?
Yeah, so that's a very, very interesting question that can go into a very, very deep level of conversation. But essentially, AI can be your best friend or your worst enemy when it comes to organizations. We've already seen that AI is capable of building viruses and making it undetectable to a lot of systems. We've already seen that people have tried to do that with ChatGPT, thus the limitations on the tool now. So most definitely, I think a major risk is AI, and that's exactly why a lot of the security tools like TOPIA, like some of the other tools that we make use of at CRS or Distributor CRS, make use of AI and machine learning, right? So that's definitely something that we need to be doing. We need to have those conversations about integrating AI into our workflow to protect against those types of attacks that will come from AI. We see that quite a bit in stuff like ransomware as a service, where they're now using AI to speed up the rate of attacks that they are able to generate, as an example. So making it undetectable. So yeah, I think that's definitely something that we need to be wary of, but also implement within our organization. Okay. I see there is another question here. Does TOPIA provide an option to generate summary of vulnerabilities in a PDF or Word format similar to a report? Definitely, there is a executive summary that is available on the dashboard. So on the opening of the dashboard, there's download links pretty much everywhere, and TOPIA will allow you to download that executive summary for the vulnerabilities, or summary of that as a high level. And then you can even go ahead and download more in-depth reports throughout the rest of your dashboard, or you can automate other reports for, let's say, management and etc. So another one, does TOPIA require periodic updates or undergo any scheduled downtime? So TOPIA is a fully SaaS-based solution, so all updates and etc. is handled for you. So there's nothing really that you have to worry about there. And in terms of downtime, this is another one. Is there any way that TOPIA can treat before you get into the server, or TOPIA can only detect vulnerabilities and remediate? So TOPIA is not going to be your EDR or is not going to be your EDR and antivirus tool. It's not going to be your proactive threat detection and response. You still need those tools. This is strictly for your visibility into vulnerabilities and your ability to remediate them. So think of it more of a system hardening than a response tool.
All right, excellent. Sorry, I just lost you for a while there, Tristan. Is it a lightweight agent?
Yes, most definitely. TOPIA can run concurrently with another tool. It's most definitely we've done this in another environment before. That's exactly where we got our comparisons from. So it does work well with other tools. It's not going to interfere with any of the other systems.
Does TOPIA offer free online training? And I did not actually get the rest of that question. Tristan, can you see it on your side? Does TOPIA offer free online training? How do we sign up? Thank you very much for your question. We did run formal training towards the end of last year, but as Tristan mentions, the system is very intuitive. So although we do provide training from CRS level with every single engagement, the vendor does provide training every six months or so. But again, it's not something that we sell formally. It's more of something that comes with the solution as we sell the solution or implement the solution. All right, with that being said, thank you, Tristan. Thank you, Mr. Van Hentini. Your time has been extremely valuable to Team CRS who assisted setting this up. Marketing, Caroline, well done. It was a very good session. I enjoyed it very much, enjoyed listening to the guys. To all the attendees, very much for attending. Thank you for your time. Again, I hope you got something extremely valuable out of this, and we intend hearing from you very soon with regards to your thoughts. The recordings will be posted on our YouTube channel within due course, so please keep track of that. With that being said, I think we will close off the session.